not to be chained forever to the posts of poverty.
5 parts to this talk. 1, why the anniversary is important. 2, who the weavers were. 3, past commemorations. 4, the importance of knowing your history. 5, why the weavers, in spite of what's been done today, why the weavers still don't matter in Glasgow, and what are you going to do about it? So, the 1787 strike wasn't the first. Before then, labour relations were conducted by negotiation and withdrawal of labour as they are now. But the first thing you should know that it's very difficult to secure a strike or a successful withdrawal of labour without having a workplace. The system of working was that each weaver was self-employed with a loom in his own house, so there's no collective workplace for collective organisation. Agents for the manufacturers would distribute warps, which would be delivered to the weaver and woven into cloth for an agreed price. The agents would later collect the woven cloth and then pay the price. Throughout 1787, prices were dropped. The weavers refused to work for starvation wages. And it should be noted that organisation of strikes and demonstration is really hugely difficult when there's no collective workplace, because your neighbour or the weavers in the next street might be so desperate that they would agree to work for next to nothing. How do you get any agreement, any solidarity against the agents and the merchants who want you to do the job for nothing? In a community that's not already united, it would have been impossible. The procedure was that if a weaver was found to have accepted a job at the lower price, his web would be taken from him physically and delivered back to the door of the manufacturer or to the agent who had distributed it. The weavers in Calton incredibly conducted a 12-week strike, with webs being returned, unwoven to their source, to ensure that the merchants got the message loud and clear. At the beginning of the strike, there was a formal resolution made not to offer violence to any man or his work, and the evidence given at the trials of the Union men in 1788, there were many instances given of the care and respect given to the property of the manufacturers and the unacceptably priced work. The weavers, given their poverty and their circumstances, were really remarkably restrained. Some of the merchants for whom they worked were ostentatiously wealthy, and a local example of this is David Dale, known as the father of the Scottish cotton industry. He'd learned linen weaving himself in Paisley, then went into dealing in yarn and employed other weavers. By 1783, now that's 4 years before the strike, he'd risen to become a Glasgow Bailey, a founder of the new Chamber of Commerce of Glasgow, and he had built himself a £6,000 mansion house in Charlotte Street, which if you look at the window there, you can see the site of it. And Charlotte Street at that time was a new gated community because all the weavers were living cheek by jowl with this great rich society just beside them. So how they restrained themselves as much as they did, I don't know. The contrast between the cheap brick and pan-tile dwelling houses of the weavers of Calton and Dale's mansion house could not have been greater. I'm glad to see all the pies going round. Feel free to dig in. Keep one for me at the end. Now, it's very clear from the writings of the economist Adam Smith and the evidence given in the court case in Edinburgh in 1788 that strike action was quite common. There was always a kind of ritual show of strength on both sides as a prelude to a satisfactory compromise. The difference in 1787, as you've heard, was that the Lord Provost of Glasgow called out the military, and even before the Riot Act was attempted to be read, even before that, the troops opened fire and shot 6 men. Before then, the death of 6 men in a strike would have been regarded as a tragedy and a failure on the part of the city magistrates and the Lord Provost. In 1787, shooting of the weavers was regarded as a triumphant deliverance. The Lord Provost, as we've heard already, granted the freedom of the city to the colonel of the regiment, and he entertained the officers to a celebration dinner, and every soldier in 2 regiments was given a gift of shoes and stockings from the city funds. The common good and comfort of the working community was no longer a consideration, and shooting the demonstrators was now an acceptable way to end a strike. In their own words, the Glasgow magistrates resolved to suppress these daring combinations wherever the consequences may be to the unfortunate individuals who may suffer. So it's, deal tack the hindmost. If you go and strike, you're going to get shot. These brutal acts polarised the interest of the classes, and the class war was truly begun in 1787. The shootings were followed by mass arrests. Henry McIndoe, the weaver's secretary, James Granger, Duncan Cherry, 4 of the Miller family from Cambuslang, John Stewart, Duncan McDougall, William Miller, Peter Henry, Robert Anderson, and others were jailed for varying lengths of time. James Granger was brought to trial in Edinburgh in July 1788, and an example made of him. Granger was 38 years old at the time. He had a wife and 6 wains dependent on him, and the judge commented that the common people had too generally imbibed the idea that the crime of which the panel had been convicted was a very venial one, whereas he would venture to say there could not be anyone figure so destructive to society and so highly atrocious in its nature and tendency. So no more strikes, thank you. So for being on strike, Granger was in jail for a year before being sentenced to be whipped through the streets of Edinburgh by the public executioner. He was then allowed to put his affairs in order before being banished from Scotland for 7 years. Edinburgh, the Athens of the North, and thought to be one of the places of great civilization and refinement, was chosen as the place for this brutal savagery, because to whip Granger in Glasgow might have caused more problems for the magistrates here, so Edinburgh was safe. And I'm pleased to say that Granger survived all of this and was back to take part in the Great Strike of 1811 to 1812. And he died aged 75 in 1825 and is buried in the Weaver's Lair in the Calton burial ground. So the 1787 strike is the start of near 250 years' struggle to establish legal and effective trades union to protect the people of Scotland from exploitation. We need to know and we need to understand and appreciate that history. Everybody involved in the current disputes, for example at the University of Glasgow, all the further education colleges, the disputes with Glasgow Life, and the issues which the RMT and ASLEF are dealing with, they need to know this history and be aware of it. Now, secondly, I want just to say some words about who these weavers were. Although poor in possessions and consumer goods, they were considered to be the aristocrats of labour. Of course, every woman in the weaving community spun yarn to sell to the manufacturers to supplement the family income. As the songs of Burns and others show, women of the time were rarely seen without a distaff and a spindle in their hands, or, like Jenny at her spinning wheel, women were constantly spinning to live a boon distress, a blow envy. That is, live but not starve, but live without being envied by anybody else. Every unmarried woman was called a spinster, and this term was only dropped from Scottish birth and death certificates in 1984. That's about 150 years after spinning ceased to be a necessity for family survival, so just think on that. I think one of the finest descriptions of the Scottish weavers was written by the Red Clydesider Davy Kirkwood in his autobiography. As many of you will know, he went to Westminster in the 1922 general election as MP for Dumbarton Boroughs. But Kirkwood was a native of Parkhead, a weaving village just like the Calton. His great-grandfather was a carter, not a weaver, and he was known as Rubble Kirkwood. This was because he was employed to cart rubble from Parkhead to Glasgow Green to fill up the hollow core of the monument to Lord Nelson when it was being built in 1806, and he was at it for such a long time with his rubble that's how he got his name. And Kirkwood in his book writes, Rubble Kirkwood was a man of strong character. Like all the folk of the weaving centres, he was an ardent radical. There seems to have been a subtle association between weaving and radicalism in Scotland. It may be that those men and women weaving patterns of cloth wove at the same time patterns of life. Or it may be that the work, although intricate, became automatic and allowed the mind to browse in the meadows of thought. Whatever the cause, these old weavers were radicals, and like all radicals, they dearly loved an argument. Unlike their English cousins, they could all read and write. The old church parish schools taught their pupils how to learn, and long before education was made compulsory by law, it had become a necessity by tradition. There were no illiterate weavers. For to be a weaver, to be illiterate, was to lack dignity. I often think, Kirkwood writes, that the unity of these weaver folk has never been equalled. They were a corporate body. They all knew each other. They chose their wives from their own circle. They were all poor. They had to work, man and wife, long, long hours for an existence. But there was a fine spirit among them. They had cooperative schemes that have not been equalled by the vast cooperative societies of later days. In Parkhead, the weavers formed the Parkhead Economic Society. They pledged themselves to buy all their goods from the society. At the end of every 6 months' trading, there took place the event known as the Cúntoot. Stock was taken, the accounts were audited, the surplus was divided among the members equally. And unlike modern cooperative dividend, which is based on purchases, the Cúntoot was based on membership. The poor old lone woman with only a few shillings a week got her share equal to that of a man with a good wage and several sons working. And they bought according to their means. They shared equally in the surplus. The surplus was distributed not in cash, but in goods, meal and flour, blankets and books. And this is another thing that we don't recognise in Scotland, how the whole co-op movement was pioneered in Scotland. Now, as a child, I was fed Pioneer custard. I don't know if you remember that, Pioneer custard from the co-op. It was so named because the Rochdale pioneers had pioneered cooperation in 1832. No, they did not. The Govan weavers had pioneered cooperation back in the 18th century. So had the Parkhead weavers, so had the weavers of Bannockburn and various other places. Co-ops were common in Scotland, yet we get fed this story about the Rochdale pioneers and Tall Puddle and so on. Kirkwood also describes how they shared the buying and the reading of newspapers, keeping themselves up to date with global news. So the handloom weavers of any community in Scotland were literate, articulate, and well respected by those in other trades. The official byline of the Glasgow Incorporation of Weavers, that's the master body, which to this day has its offices in Glassford Street and Trades House, is that the weaver's art is so renowned that rich and poor without it cannot go. In other words, society needs cloth to function, and weavers provide that cloth. Now, the song written by David Shaw, Weaver and Forfer in the 1840s, sums this up. Billy Connolly gave it new life in the 1970s by changing weavers to wellies. And that's a bit unfortunate. And I can't sing to you, and the singing's coming later. So you'll need to be patient, but just listen to the words. We're all met together here to sit and to crack, with our glasses in our hands and our work upon our back, but there's nae trade among them all that can mend or can mak if it wasna for the work of the weavers. If it wasna for the weavers, what would you do? You wouldna hae a clue that's made out of woo. You wouldna hae a coat neither black nor blue if it wasna for the work of the weavers. Now there's folk that hae nae need of other tradesmen's work. Women need nae barber. Ruth here will tell you that. The dikers need nae clerk, but none of them can do without a coat or a sack. No, they canna do without the work of the weavers. Now there's sodgers and there's sailors and hiremen and all, there's doctors and there's ministers and them that love the law, and our friends in South America, though them we never saw, we ken they wear the work of the weavers. Now the weaving is a trade that can never fail so long as he need a cloth to keep a body hale. So let us all be merry o'er a bicker o' good ale, and we'll drink to the work o' the weavers. If it wasn't for the weavers, what would you do? You wouldn't hae your cloak that's made out of woo. You wouldn't hae a coat neither black nor blue if it wasn't for the work o' the weavers. I think the tight-knit, interdependent community Kirkwood describes was maybe similar to that of the Scottish colliers and other groups who rely on their neighbour worker for their safety and for their survival. It's these groups in which we see the dignity of labour. It's not just about jobs, it's the culture and emotional fabric of the entire communities who work together and who live together. Now, thirdly, I want to mention past commemorations of the 1787 strike. And it shouldn't come as any surprise, it took almost 50 years before they got the first memorial stone up in the Calton. And the only 3 names survived of the shop weavers, 3 others who died. We don't know their names because belonging to a trade union had become a very dangerous business. State and municipal terrorism, the shootings, the whippings, the beatings, the transportations became a way of social control to the extent that destroying the prevailing political and social system seemed the very best options opened. The American and French revolutions brought hope, destroyed by the savagery of the Scottish political trials of the 1790s and the failed radical rising of 1820, after which James Wilson, a weaver from Straven, was hanged and beheaded on the Glasgow Green in front of the High Court for the alleged crime of treason. Now, he was dead when they beheaded him. The beheading was simply done to terrorise the Glasgow population. The local hangman refused to do this job, and a medical student from the University of Glasgow was engaged instead. The economics of justice dictated that the medical student had to go to Stirling 8 days later wearing the same blood-stained cloak and hood and using the same axe on the 2 weavers being executed there. That cloak and axe are still on display in my last place of work, the Stirling Smith Art Gallery and Museum, as a testimony to the brutal way in which workers have been treated in Scotland. But to return to the stone put up in the Calton burial ground in 1836, it had the following inscription: "This is the property of the weaving body under the charge of the 5 districts of Calton." Calton was all divided up. erected by them in memory of John Page, Alexander Miller, and we heard a testimony from Miller's descendant here today. Where is he? Is he run away home? Jim. I think Jim needs a wee round of applause for what he did yesterday. It was a magnificent testimony which we've been privileged to hear. So there was Alexander Miller and James Ainsley, who at a meeting of that body for resisting a reduction of their wages were upon 3rd of September 1787 martyred by the military under the orders of the civic authorities of Glasgow, firing upon the multitude. Also to the memory of their brethren in the trade, James Granger, James Gray, Alexander Meggot, Duncan Cherry, James Morton, Thomas Miller, John Jaffrey, the first four highly distinguished for zeal on behalf of their trade. In 1931, Harry McShane, a member of John Maclean's Tramps Trust, and I have to say that Calton Books have done a magnificent wee book on John Maclean, and also it's only a £5, and you should be buying it for Christmas. It's so good. Harry McShane researched and wrote the first history of the 1787 strike, and the stone was renewed by the Glasgow Trades Council in 1931 and 57. Harry McShane was a political activist throughout his life, and when the chance arose to have a portrait of him painted in 1977 for the People's Palace, he chose as his background, of course, the Calton Weavers Memorial in the cemetery. In preparation for the bicentenary 10 years later in 1987, as a museum curator, we had planning meetings arranged to what to do for best. So we planned and delivered a full exhibition on weavers and weaving in Glasgow. We reconstructed a typical one-storey weaver's dwelling house of brick and pan tile with an earthen floor, showing how the people had to live. Conscious that this was a temporary exhibition, we collected a surviving brick and pan tile cottage from a piece of industrial wasteland in Tollcross, with the intention of putting it together in or near Glasgow Green. Needless to say, that went by the board. In the exhibition, we showed every weaver's banner and trade union box, and set up the hand warping loom and the weaving loom as well. And the exhibition was across three rooms on the top floor in the People's Palace. In front of the building, Glasgow District Council Parks Department created a large raised bed with red bedding plants spelling out Calton Weavers 1787 to 1987. However, the 1787 strike marked the birth of the labour movement in Glasgow, so we also sought a means of trying to summarise what that had been and how it was represented in the People's Palace collections. And for that reason, we commissioned a mural depicting 200 years of working class history from 1787 to the miners' strike of 1984 to 5 and beyond. The artist was the young School of Art graduate Ken Curry, who was very politically aware, engaged, active and talented enough to deliver 8 major panels interpreting that story, designed for the octagonal dome of the top floor of the People's Palace. And thinking that regardless of what was on display beneath, the mural would always be above, so you could look up and re-engage with that history. We thought, this was the best way of doing it. And the mural incorporated lots and lots of objects in the People's Palace collection which couldn't all be in show at once or couldn't be contextualised. So panel 1 was on the 1787 strike. Panel 2 was Let Truth and Justice Be Woven Together, Liberty is Our Fabric, covering the time from the French Revolution to the 1820 Rising. The year before, we had acquired a small metal plate about the size of this phone, and it was nothing to look at, but it said a lot about unions. It was from the Society box of the Glasgow Powerloom Drawers and Twisters Association, which explained the union lesson of the bunch of sticks. They weren't very good at poetry, but they knew how to organise. On the 16th of October 1833, our society was formed and chose a committee. We drawers and twisters did intermix and took example from the bunch of sticks. We could be broken single one by one, but now we are united and never can. The artist was able to depict this along with the planting of liberty trees, preparation of weapons for revolution, and the various banners of the era. Moving on in history, panel 3 was titled The Great Reform Agitation, Unionist Strength, and it depicted the era when unions had to operate as secret societies, whilst the members participated in the big Reform Bill processions of 1832, 1866 and 1884, hoping for political justice. Over the years, the People's Palace had acquired many trade symbols that had been carried in these demonstrations. For example, a wee pottery kiln from the Britannia pottery, one of many which the workers carried on poles, stuffed with smoking rags, so that the image of the works would be in the procession. There were miniature pieces of furniture also for poles and beehives of industry, a giant trowel on a pole from a bricklayer. And these processions that took place in Glasgow marked hope for political improvement, and the folk participating felt that they were making history, hence all these donations to the museum. The descriptions of the processions in the contemporary newspapers were really colourful and inspirational. On more than one occasion, the furniture makers built a big deathbed for the House of Lords, paraded on a horse-drawn lorry, a wee bit like what the Keeley does from time to time today. Ken Curry, as an artist, was able to paint such a procession with the participants carrying the processional items in the museum collection. Panel 4 was the Socialist Vision, Workers of the World, and it dealt with the birth of scientific socialism as a solution to the human suffering created by capitalism. And this is very, very important in Glasgow because we had good foundations of anarchist and communist groups here. In the centre, the artist depicted a group of Marxist-inspired foundry workers forging the central proposition of the 1848 Communist Manifesto that the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle. And we would do well to keep that in mind today, which is why we wanted it painted into the story. Poverty and want are shown in this picture on one side, and on the other some socialist solutions. The Clarion Scouts and the outdoor movement embraced by the Scottish Labour Party of 1888, the Carbeth huts and the socialist Sunday schools. Panel 5 was devoted to John Maclean, and titled by his declaration that we can make Glasgow a Petrograd, a revolutionary storm centre second to none. And Maclean is depicted in the centre teaching his Marxist economics, while suffragette, anti-war movement events and other events associated with the Red Clyde swirl around him. Panel 6, Fight or Starve, Wandering Through the 30s, is an oblique reference to the Arthur Johnson song. I wandered through the 30s, out of work now and again. I saw the black shirts marching, the things they did in Spain. I brought my kids up decent, I taught them wrong from right, but Hitler was the man who came and taught them how to fight. The theme is the Hunger Marchers, and featured are Harry McShane and others of the National Unemployed Workers Movement. and the words of the Internationale are featured on a banner. Panel 7 is devoted to Upper Clyde shipbuilders and the work-in. All of these panels by Ken Curry involved marches and banners going from one era to the other. And I wish I could sing you descriptions of these as well, because each one of them involves and incorporates folk songs. The sequence starts and ends with cloth, going from the cloth of the Calton weavers to unfurling our history, our future, where a future banner is being unrolled, lit by the headlamps of the striking miners, while a group of people are studying the Labour Movement collection in the People's Palace to try and find a new way of doing things, while a future May Day meeting on Glasgow Green can be seen in the distance. So this story of working class history in Glasgow was meant to be a permanent reference point for the political and industrial history of the working classes. However, this kind of history was found to be unacceptable in Glasgow, and the collection of trade union banners and other artefacts had been in store for almost 40 years now. The bronze bust of Red Clydesider Willie Gallagher, who died in 1965, which was paid for and presented to the People's Palace by Glasgow Trades Council and many other unions to mark the 70th anniversary of the Glasgow 1919. It's been in store for over 30 years. In fact, it's sitting on the floor because it can be studied by students apparently there, and it's not welcome in the People's Palace. And thanks to a Heritage Lottery makeover in 1998, the People's Palace was safely cleansed of its historical political storylines. In 2022, all of these pictures were removed altogether. Now, at the burial ground itself, a few of us continue to meet every 3rd of September to remember the weavers. The last occasion I was there was 3rd of September 1992, when the activist and chair of the Friends of the People's Palace, Hugh Savage, had commissioned and personally, and he was a retired plumber, he didn't have loads of money, but he'd personally paid for a new memorial stone for the weavers. On that occasion, there was Norman Bissell from the EIS and Jim Friel of SOGAT speaking. And I'm sorry to say that within the year, this very lovely stone had been smashed by vandals and nothing of it now remains. You can see a photograph of it in Hugh Savage's biography, which has been written by James Kelman. Which brings me to part 4. You'll be glad I'm getting through this. Part 4 is the importance of knowing your own history. I've heard so many people say that they'd never heard, never been taught about, or know nothing about the strike of the Glasgow weavers, and this is largely because the victors always write the histories. I don't know if you're aware of it, but 2023 is the 300th anniversary of the birth of the economist Adam Smith, born in Kirkcaldy, author of A Wealth of Nations. He who was appointed rector of Glasgow University just weeks after the massacre of the weavers. Smith has always been the beloved of the Conservative Party, possibly because he told us how the invisible hand of the market guides the economy. He must have known that the dirty hands of the East India Company in dumping cheap woven goods from India had led to the distress in Glasgow in 1787, and if he did, he said nothing. But this year there's a brand new biography of him, Adam Smith, What He Thought and Why It Still Matters. It was serialised by Radio 4 as Book of the Week 2 weeks ago, so that everybody in Britain is getting an insight into it. And it was written by, are you surprised, Jessie Norman, Tory MP for Hereford and Minister for State in the Department of Transport. The Tories have always looked after their own in ways we've barely begun to understand. If the weavers are not part of history as studied in our schools and universities today, then what is? It's amazing what our universities now consider to be worthy of historical and archaeological study. For example, there's an ongoing study at the University of Glasgow to uncover what remains of the Glasgow Garden Festival, 1988. In case you've forgotten, the Garden Festival was an English Conservative initiative led by Margaret Thatcher's Environment Secretary Michael Heseltine, with the chief executive of the Garden Festival being George Chesworth of the Royal Air Force, who had fought in both the Korean and Falklands War. I don't know what his gardening qualifications were, but he was the chief executive. Garden festivals were by their nature temporary money-making outfits as a means to shift public money to private developers in the name of wasteland reclamation, and they weren't meant to last. And I find it disturbing that resources can be put into researching the detritus of this Tory charade that was foisted upon Glasgow. But as I say, the victors always write the history and fund the archaeology to suit their narrative. And the message from this study is to the effect that Glasgow's miles better through embracing Westminster-funded initiatives like the Garden Festival, the City of Culture, and the Commonwealth Games. All of that means that we can forget about the industries by which we lived and worked and the industrial disputes which came with them, because it isn't real history, it isn't culture. Glasgow University is in partnership with Glasgow Life, sharing premises at the Kelvin Hall and making the museum's collection available to the university students and researchers as encouragement to write papers on how important culture, and we're not talking about Glasgow culture here, for that's not recognised, how important culture is to the economic well-being of the city of Glasgow. Now, it would take me a very long time to recount for you the hagiographic mythology which has been built around the war profiteer Burrow and his collection. Burrow was a man who valued his profits so much that he had his ships built with minimal crew space so that smaller boned, smaller built Lascar seamen from the Far East could be employed at cut price rates to sail them. They wouldn't have to pay the wages that Scottish seamen were being paid. The racial tensions, the inhumane deprivations suffered, and the suicides of these workers are detailed in the latest Burrow book, but not in Pollock Park itself, as this would indeed frighten the tourists away. Glasgow Museums has been in the pocket of Glasgow Conservative Councillor William Burrow since he loaned them items from his private collection for the 1901 Glasgow International Exhibition. It's Glasgow's misfortune that Burrow failed to persuade both the Westminster government and its London County Council counterpart to take on the collection and house it in London. That was his first choice. That's where he wanted to have his collection cited. Glasgow City Council, as you know, has just rebuilt the borough for the second time in 40 years. And let me tell you, the way maintenance goes, it's going to be needing rebuilt again about 2043. And the borough trustees will be there to see that it will be done and done well. Regardless of what other public services are sacrificed to feed this Pollock Park vampire, the borough is still going to take priority. This is why the story of the Glasgow Weavers still doesn't matter today. Which brings me to the fifth and final part of my talk. What are we going to do about it? And who's going to speak up for the history of the ordinary folk of Glasgow? Many of Glasgow's older institutions survive and are able to promote their own histories. For example, the Merchants' House is still there in George Square, and it's been going since medieval times, as has the university. And the Trades House in Glassford Street is still there in all its 18th century pomp, proclaiming the merits of the 14 incorporated trades, albeit most of the present-day tradesmen seem to be solicitors. And if you want to see how the power structure in this city works, take a look at the seating plan of Glasgow Cathedral and the areas designated for the council, the trades, the merchants, the university, the army and the navy. Our Botanic Gardens has also been going since the foundation of the university in 1471, and it will never be threatened or have resources cut, unlike the other 90 parks and green spaces to which Glasgow lays claim. The so-called Kibble Palace was supplied to Glasgow Corporation by John Kibble, who was the Elon Musk of his time, and it was supplied at a very high price in 1891. It's in tip-top condition, in contrast to the Springburn Winter Gardens, gifted outright by Hugh Reid in 1900. After Glasgow City Council failed to demolish the Springburn Gardens in 1966 and 1985, I don't know how they failed, they managed so much else. Springburn Winter Gardens stands as a total ruin. Glasgow City Council, regardless of time or party, has always favoured the neoliberal world and acted as the friend and promoter of those in the business class who like looking after their own interest first. And needless to say, the People's Palace is sitting there on the green, gutted, eviscerated, destroyed, and every meaning taken out of it. So how can we tackle the powers that are for the benefit of Glasgow's own history? The Calton burial ground is truly in a mess. Can the burial ground be adopted by volunteers? Is this the road that we have to go down these days? Because the necropolis and the southern necropolis have done that and have been able to make a go of it. We need to guarantee the survival of the Calton burial ground and the Weaver's Lair within it. And I'm an old woman and my time has come to shut up, so I'm throwing these questions out to the young among you here. Thank you very much for listening. Bring on the pies.